All right, everybody, this is the second lecture for psychology, and this is focusing on kind of the overall picture of the different schools of thought within psychology. Because kind of one of the truisms within psychology is there's a lot of different perspectives that exist within it. You can get two psychologists, put them in the same room together, and they will vehemently disagree with each other. And this is what this focuses on. Because all these different perspectives sometimes will rise as rise as a result of challenging another set of ideas, or they build off the ideas of another. Now, in reality, today, what most psychologists will do is they will kind of pull from multiple different disciplines and create kind of a try to create a more comprehensive view of human behavior, thought processes, and what's going on inside. So, the first school of thought was called Structuralism, and this was developed mainly by a guy named Wilhelm Wundt, but Edward Titchener, who was his kind of number one pupil, helped out with it. And together they developed this idea called introspection. And really what it was what was a person's first response to some sort of stimuli. So eat a piece of pie, look at a sunset, lick a cat. What was kind of the person's response to that? How did they respond to that? And what they would do is they would train their subjects to in what was called self-observation. And this was a way for them to kind of collect the data. Now, this is considered the first kind of scientific school of psychology because this was the first to try to develop a systemic procedure in order to study behavior. And again, the main idea behind it was if we can understand a person's experience to things, we can begin to understand what's going on in their mind. And they actually put out this kind of idea that other psychologists will build off of, where it's pretty much like this. The reality that you experience, again, like right now, you are sitting watching this. You are drawing conclusions about your reality. This is interesting. This is boring. The seat is hard. It's hot. It's cold in the room. All these little different experiences that's going on that's kind of specific towards you, that actually is the first step, in a way, of you kind of more or less constructing the world around you. All right, let me put it this way. Your reality is not necessarily the same reality that's shared by everybody else. What you think of as reality is actually more or less assembled in your brain from electrical impulses that are sent to you from your five senses. And that is really, that's kind of the idea that these guys begin to put out. So they didn't quite put it out the same way I just did, but this is kind of where their thoughts will ultimately lead to. Now, one problem with structuralism was it was very, very subjective. So again, two people can have very, very subjective experiences. So from there came the idea of functionalism. And this is founded by Edward James, or William James, and his kind of disciple, Edward Thorndike. And their view was very Darwinian in nature. So pretty much what they did was they took the idea of Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection and applied it to human behavior and human thought. And pretty much their thesis was people learn things, people think things, people feel things, people remember things in order to survive. And those thoughts, those feelings, the things they learned, the things they remembered, if those contribute to a person's survival, those things will be passed down to their offspring. He is considered the father of psychology. in the United States, mainly because he wrote the first textbook. So technically he was kind of the second guy, Edward James was, or Williams James was, but because he wrote the first textbook, he gets to be called the father of psychology. That's really just kind of how it goes. And again, they focus on the actions of the conscious mind and the goals of certain behaviors. So, for example, something basic. How many of y'all have ever experienced the idea of being hangry? You're so hungry, you actually begin to get angry. Now, what James would say is that's actually a evolutionary trait, where if you're going to survive, because remember, our ancestors, if you follow Darwin's model, our ancestors had to compete all the time, even with things like food, where you may not have food, but your neighbor may have the food. So you may have to actually do something that we would consider bad, like maybe kill them and take their food, or kill someone and eat them, or kill the mountain lion and eat it. Anger can give you an extra burst of energy and help you be able to do things that normally you would not be able to do in a calm and reasonable way. Fast forward to today, you're standing in the lunch line, your stomach is growling, the person in front of you isn't moving fast enough, they're too busy flirting with the cafeteria workers, and you are getting, you're like, okay, you can move now. You can move now. You can move now! And evolutionary trait. And that's where he would say that would come from, all the way back to our ancestors, having to compete with food. Now, kind of keeping with the Darwinian view, was Sir Francis Galton, and he looked at kind of inheritable traits. Now, with the functionalists, their kind of view was these things are passed down. Galton was about what could we do to kind of help evolution along. So he studied heredity, biological traits that are passed down from parents to the child, and how do those influence the behaviors. So he studied famous ancestors of important people, believed that genius was hereditary. And because he found certain families seem to have certain traits that just seem to show up all the time. Smart people tended to have smart kids. Charismatic people tended to have charismatic children. And his thought was what you can do is you can, arrange people to have good marriages so they can have good children. So they can pass down those good genes. And for the people who have the bad traits, well, you can make sure those, just make sure that they're not able to have children. Because you don't want those things passed down from one generation to another. Needless to say, this will ultimately lead to a few very dark places in psychology and just science in general. Eugenics, Nazis. But one thing that he does do is he does begin the nature-nurture debate. Are you, when you were born, when you popped out of your mama's womb covered in placenta and cottage cheese, were you a blank slate that experience would write and turn you into the person that you are? Or are you a genetic product and everything about you is already determined at birth? This is kind of that debate that exists even today. Now, for the most part, most psychologists agree that it's some mix of both. It's a combination of your genes, it's a combination of your life experiences. Now the question is, how much of what? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 40-60, 30-70? This is a part of that debate that goes on today. Now, take a second and look at this. Oops, I messed up. What do you see? You probably said chair. And you're absolutely right. And at the same time, you're absolutely wrong. Because three guys from Germany, Max Wertmeier, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kafka, they instituted what is called the Gestalt School of Psychology. And what they do is, in a way, they sort of build off the structuralist and a little bit of the functionalist as well. But what they said was, we have certain perceptions of the world. And these are based off of our gestalts, or our patterns, or configurations that we have about things. So you looked at this and you probably saw a chair. Your brain automatically went to chair. You didn't go rollies, seat, back, armrests. Right here, you probably look at this and you see, you look at this and you probably say, well, that's a cube. It's a cube because it follows the patterns and you are filling in the missing pieces. Same thing with this. You look at this, you might see two faces, you might see a vase, and that's really just because what you're looking for, again, are the patterns. You're looking at the configurations of it. And it follows, and the configuration follows into a particular pattern that exists somewhere within your memory. There's a whole story about this. It's actually talked about by the ancient Greeks, Plato specifically. And it's called the allegory of the cave. And it's all about how we recognize patterns. And I might post a link to it on y'all's Schoology page so you can actually look into that a little bit. Now, the psychoanalytic theory, or the psychoanalytic psychologists, pretty much built around two guys. First one is Sigmund Freud, and the second one, who is really just an example of the student surpassing the master, is Carl Jung. Sigmund Freud right here, Carl Jung right here. And Carl Jung is personally my favorite. And what they do is they focus on the unconscious mind. Because in psychoanalytic psychology, it's all about what are the things inside of you that are influencing you that you yourself are not aware of. And some people say it's like, well, I'm aware of everything. With the psychoanalytic stuff, your conscious mind is literally only the smallest tip to an iceberg, and there's so much more going on beneath. So what they want to do is figure out what is going on within the unconscious. Because those are the things that are the most responsible for your human behavior. So those kind of two tricks, or two techniques that they have. One was called free association, where a patient would just say everything that comes to their mind. Just pure stream of thought, rambling, for lack of a better term. And then the second one was dream analysis. And they both looked at dreams in their own way. Like Freud was looking for certain things, Jung was looking for certain things, but they were both looking at dreams because they both kind of agreed on this one point. Dreams, to a certain extent, is our unconscious trying to figure out something. And when you wake up and you remember something from your dreams, and this is more of a Jungian idea, if you wake up from a dream and you remember it, the thing you remember from your dream is something that your unconscious was not able to figure out. So, because your unconscious wasn't able to figure it out, it pushed it to your consciousness, and from there, your consciousness can try to figure out what your unconscious could not figure out. And it does this mainly by, man, I had this really weird dream yesterday. Can you tell me what it was about? Boom. There you go. And really, what would happen would be the psychoanalyst would interpret or try to interpret the meanings to the dreams, and but mainly their thing is this: taking all their ideas, boiling it down to one thing. There is a lot of things going on inside of you that you yourself are not totally aware of. Memories that you think you've forgotten that you haven't, thoughts that you have that you may not want to realize that you have. Um, you, with this, you are a complicated creature driven by things you do not realize that you are driven by. Behavioral psychologists, these are people that focus on observable behavior. That's really it. What do we observe? How can we train it? This starts with people like Ivan Pavlov, who is the first guy, B.F. Skinner, this guy, and John B. Watson, right here. This guy, though, the middle one, he is the one that is perhaps the most interesting. Because Pavlov started the whole thing with his dogs ringing bells and stuff like that. This guy did so much for this in learning about behavioral science or behavioral psychology. People that really follow him are the people who design things like video games, slot machines, and everything else. And all of them said this, but B.F. Skinner really was like, okay, yeah, it's kind of scary in a way. But he says ultimately you can teach behavior because behavior is taught, behavior is learned. And what I mean by this is I can actually take anyone with enough time, with enough effort, I can train you to be a master thief or a serial killer. Or I can design something that makes you addicted. Video game companies, they actually hire behavioral psychologists in order to find ways to make their video games addictive. Especially like the mobile games and stuff like that. When we do behavioral psychology, we'll go into this. But yeah, it's actually really interesting how they do it. Like if you ever played, what game was it? Destiny 1 or Destiny 2. Bungie, when Destiny 2 was about to be released, they actually hired a team of behavioral psychologists in order to make sure people kept playing the game, even after they were no longer enjoying the game. Humanistic psychology. This is where you will find the kind of like the self-help guru type thing. It's kind of a, what's the word? Insult to call it self-help, but, a lot of people consider it an insult. But the idea is really this. Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Rollo May, what they believed was human nature is evolving and self-directed. You change as you get older and as you experience things. Now, with their thing is you can actually take control of who you are. And this is really the big thing. Humans are not controlled by events, but they may be influenced by events. And what this means is the environment that you live in, whether it be nurturing or not nurturing, safe or not safe. It will either allow your full potential to come out, or it will it will force your full potential to be suppressed. And each person, they would say, is unique. And each person with unique needs, drives, and those types of things. And This is very much the kind of, the ideas where you can, again, try to help somebody really reach their full potential in whatever it may be. Like these are kind of like the life coaches or guidance counselors or those types of people. When you're trying to like just figure out what to do. Like, you may have a job and you may feel like you could do more, but you don't know how to do more. These are the kinds of psychologists that would try to equip you in order for you to do more and reach more of your potential. The cognitive psychologists are people like Jean Piaget, Noam Chomsky. He's not really a psychologist, but this guy, he's not really a psychologist, but he had a big influence on psychology. And Leon Fetzinger. A lot of it, though, is right here. Jean Piaget. Um, Pretty much they looked at how do people process and store information, and how does this information influences our thinking, our language, and our problem solving. Um, because yeah, this stuff actually gets pretty complicated, so I'm gonna have to just keep it short. Because even though they're all tied together, they all go in very radically different positions. But to kind of just summarize it, Piaget studied children and the games that small children would play, like like tag or hide and seek and those types of things. And he studied how children would play games. And what he found was children would play games. To play the games, you have to have certain sets of rules. If a child playing the game doesn't want to follow the same rules as everybody else, they're kind of pushed out. The other kids are like, well, you're not playing with us anymore. Same thing happens in society when you're when you're a teenager, when you're in your 20s, when you're in your 30s, when you're in your 50s. You have the game of society. Go to work, do your job, get paid. You don't follow the rules of the game. You don't show up to work. Or you do show up to work, but you don't do your job. You're too busy, doing something else. Your boss fires you. Ultimately, what that means is you weren't playing by the rules of the game. Your boss isn't going to play with you anymore. Chomsky, again, not a psychologist, but definitely influential on it. He studied language and words. And what he found was the words that we use to describe things, those shape how we perceive certain things and how we perceive events. So like, for example, if I walk up to you and say, hey, that person over there? Yeah, they're a Nazi. What does that tell you? In fact, I'll give you a real example. When I was in college, I had one teacher. She was called the Spanish Nazi. It was a Spanish class. She was very, very harsh, very, very mean. And so everybody called her the Spanish Nazi. What sort of image does that engender? It probably engenders a view of, oh man, that teacher is just a witch, but replace the W with another word, or harsh and mean and all the other stuff. You don't exactly imagine the teacher being Miss Sunshine and lollipops and throwing flowers all over the place and giving A's like candy. So in fact, I think the highest person in that class left the class with a C. So that was the highest grade. But again, what happens is those shaped our expectations ever. So for example, when I failed, I pretty much was not surprised. And me and everybody else who failed were not surprised. Actually, I technically didn't fail. I came out with a D, but I still ended up retaking the class because I did not learn anything in that class. And then you have your psychobiologists. There's one guy in particular. There's not really like any major psychobiologists that I'm aware of, and they don't even show up in the textbook. But there's one guy named Jim Fallon, not Jimmy Fallon, the crappy comedian, but Jim Fallon. This guy. That's right here. He is a neuroscientist. Now, what happened was he was doing an experiment, and we'll kind of look at him a little bit later. My arrow is terrible. But he was or he is, a neuroscientist. And he was doing a study on the brains of psychopaths in jail. And he was doing a study, and there was one particular brain. He was like, wow, this person is a nut. Like, everything about his brain, everything about his genetics. He is the perfect serial killer from a genetic standpoint and a biological standpoint. And then he found out it was him. He never killed anybody, never did anything like that. But so again, that was kind of his little study. And that was the thing that kind of really put him on the map. But what they do is they study biology and its effects on our behavior. So what is going on in our brain? What is going on in our nervous system? How are hormones impacting us? How do our genetics impact us? And of all the parts of psychology, this is the psychology that uses all the high-tech medical gear. CAT scans, MRIs, yada, yada, yada. But again, this is the, the very scientific part. A lot of times when they do like drug studies or those types of things, psychobiology will be involved in it. And then you have the last part. This is the newest of kind of psychology. This is the sociocultural psychology. And what they do is they study pretty much how does culture affect our psychology? How does our culture influence the way we view the world? And there's kind of three of them. Leonard Dobb, Lev, I can't pronounce his last name because he's Russian, and Satoshi Kanazawa, who is actually an evolutionary psychologist. So he's a bit like a kind of a mix of a psychobiologist and a heritable trait guy. And he's also a sociologist as well. He actually teaches at the London School of Economics, and he is horribly controversial. Some of his stuff, actually, I cannot teach some of what he teaches or what he talks about because it's that controversial. But what they do is they study all of them, and now these three guys and anybody else who kind of follows the discipline, is they study the influence of cultural and ethnic similarities and differences in behavior and social functioning. So this is kind of where psychology and sociology, I taught it last year, at least as of the recording of this video, and it's kind of where psychology and sociology meet. How does society influence our behaviors and mental processes? So like, for example, we're actually seeing this right now. 2 years ago, if somebody sneezed, you would just say, bless you. Today, somebody sneezes, Corona! And that's a joke that'll probably be around for a while. That is a psychological change within the greater population. It's a slight change. But because society has changed to a certain extent, to where, you guys have seen them, the people who are always wrapped up in medical masks, and I'm sure you've seen videos of like, the Karen screaming at somebody not wearing the medical mask. That is a sociocultural change as well. And again, it's a joke to be like, oh, you sneeze, you got the coronavirus. But that is a oh so slight shift within our culture. Second, the fact that we kind of go along with it, even in a joking manner, shows how our psychology has changed just a little bit in one direction. And these guys also study the impact of things like immigration, people moving from one country to another. the assimilation of those immigrants within the larger culture itself, and socioeconomic statuses such as gender. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What are the expectations that society puts on you, and the expectations that you put on society? And in some cases, they will even look in things like propaganda. How does propaganda, like in the news, influence how we perceive the world? So, like, for example, you watch the news. You sit down and you watch the news. You are going to walk away, if you don't, especially if you don't think critically and really question what's going on in the news. Because some people, they just sit back and they just passively absorb the news. If you're somebody who just passively absorbs, what happens is it is actually starting to rework your perceptions, and you don't even realize it. And that's really kind of how the study of propaganda goes in, which is long and drawn out in and of itself. That'll be something we'll talk about again a little later. And if you take sociology, you should dabble in that too as well. So, some ending thoughts. To understand behavior and mental processes, it has to be looked at from different angles. A lot of people have different things to say, and a lot of different ideas. And to a certain extent, all of them kind of have their use. That's just me being honest. Because honestly, people are messy and they're complicated. You may not think you're messy, but you're messy, even if you don't realize that you're messy. Because there's so much going on just under the hood that you're not even totally aware of that are influencing you one way or another. So again, kind of like what I said at the beginning, many different psychologists will pull from many different schools of thought in order to try to help them and everybody else when they try to explain things to people, to try to help people understand what is going on. And the next step, to try to help people become better and try, in essence, to engineer a better you. Because again, there's probably things about you, because I know there's things about me that I would like to change, that I do work to change. And psychology is a tool that can actually help people understand what's going on with their thoughts, their behaviors, deal with things like addictions, those types of things. Or even if they just have like a bad habit, or they want to learn to be more assertive because they're very, very passive in nature. What are the things that people can do to build a better them? And psychology helps them do that. That's about all for this. Peace out.